It started as an ordinary day on the bustling streets outside the precinct. Two officers, chatting and laughing among themselves, stood near a group of bystanders. Their casual demeanor gave no indication of what was about to unfold. A man in a crisp suit, his face calm but observant, walked toward the station. His presence commanded attention, yet it seemed to agitate the officers, who viewed him with unwarranted suspicion. Without cause, they stopped him, their demeanor turning confrontational. The man, maintaining his composure, answered their questions calmly, but it was clear the officers were not interested in his responses. Instead, their mockery escalated. One of them took a lit cigarette from his pocket, smirking as he brought it close to the man's arm. The crowd around them gasped, unsure if they should intervene. The man winced in pain as the cigarette was pressed against his skin, but he didn't react the way they expected. His silence only added to the tension, as if he was waiting for the right moment to speak. What neither officer realized was that this man was not just another passerby. Behind his composed exterior was a truth that would leave them speechless. The man's identity was a secret that could shake the very foundation of their careers. As the crowd murmured in disbelief, the man slowly looked up, locking eyes with the officers. His calm words that followed sent a ripple through everyone watching. But just as he was about to reveal his identity, something unexpected happened that changed the course of events entirely. What led to this shocking confrontation? And how would the officers react when the truth finally came to light? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn no one could have predicted. As the officers laughed, oblivious to the weight of their actions, the man clenched his jaw, enduring the pain with quiet strength. The growing crowd couldn't look away, their murmurs growing louder with every passing second. Who was this man, and why did he allow himself to be humiliated like this? While the officers carried on with their arrogance, the man's silence spoke volumes, leaving the witnesses puzzled. Was he waiting for the right moment to act, or was there something deeper at play? Behind the scenes, the precinct was abuzz with anticipation. Earlier that day, whispers had spread among the officers about a new chief who was set to take over. Nobody knew much about him, but the word was clear. He had a reputation for being firm yet fair. Some officers were uneasy about the change, fearing his strict approach, while others were curious to see how he would handle the job. Little did anyone suspect that the man enduring the cruel behavior right outside the station was the very person they had been discussing all morning. The officers' actions weren't just a display of cruelty, but also revealed a troubling dynamic within the precinct. They believed they were untouchable, free to mock and demean anyone they chose. Their behavior wasn't new, but it had rarely been met with consequences. This time, however, they had no idea they were crossing a line they couldn't come back from. The man, still composed, glanced briefly at the crowd before speaking in a low, calm voice. His words were measured, but their meaning carried weight, stopping the officers in their tracks for a brief moment. Yet, they still didn't understand what was happening. Little did they know, their actions had just set off a chain of events that would unravel in ways they couldn't have imagined. The officers exchanged glances, their smug expressions momentarily faltering as they tried to gauge the man's reaction. His calm demeanor unsettled them, though they quickly brushed it off, assuming he was just another helpless victim. One of the officers, the ringleader of the group, took a step closer and scoffed. "You've got something to say," he sneered, flicking ash from his cigarette onto the ground near the man's polished shoes. The man didn't flinch, his eyes steady and unwavering as they locked onto the officers. Meanwhile, whispers among the crowd grew louder. A woman standing near the edge of the group pulled out her phone, quietly recording the entire exchange. She recognized the man from a news segment earlier that week, a segment introducing the city's new precinct chief. Her heart raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. She glanced around, wondering if anyone else had connected the dots, but most were too focused on the unfolding scene to notice her subtle movements. Inside the station, a seasoned detective sat at his desk, scrolling through an email announcing the chief's arrival. The attached photo showed a man in a tailored suit, his expression stern yet approachable. As the detective glanced out the window and saw the commotion near the entrance, he froze. The man standing in the middle of the chaos looked eerily familiar. Rising from his seat, he grabbed his badge and hurried outside, his mind racing with questions. Back at the scene, the tension thickened. The man finally spoke again, his voice steady but commanding. "Do you really think this is how you should represent the badge?" he asked, his words cutting through the officer's bravado. For a moment, there was silence. The ringleader chuckled nervously, but his confidence was beginning to waver. The man's presence carried an air of authority that couldn't be ignored, and the officers, though unwilling to admit it, were starting to feel the weight of their actions. The crowd watched intently, sensing that something bigger was about to unfold. The detective pushed through the crowd, his face pale as he approached the scene. His eyes flickered between the officers and the man at the center of the standoff. He immediately recognized him. It was indeed the new precinct chief. Panic surged through him as he realized the disaster unfolding in front of him. The officers had no idea who they were antagonizing, but the detective knew that if this situation wasn't diffused immediately, it could ruin careers, reputations, and trust in their precinct. The man maintained his calm exterior, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his gaze. The crowd had grown, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Some began shouting at the officers, demanding answers, while others kept their phones raised, recording every second. The lead officer, visibly uneasy now, tried to regain control. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said, forcing a strained grin. "Why did you just move along?" But the man didn't move. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, his posture commanding. "And why don't you explain why this is acceptable behavior for someone in uniform?" His words cut through the air, turning the crowd's murmurs into gasps. His calm yet firm tone carried an authority that even the officers couldn't deny. The detective finally reached the front of the crowd and pulled the lead officer aside. "You have no idea what you're doing," he hissed, his voice low but urgent. "That man is—" Before he could finish, the man interrupted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I can speak for myself, detective." All eyes snapped back to him. He raised his hand, the faint burn mark from the cigarette clearly visible, a symbol of the disrespect he had endured. The lead officer stammered, his cocky demeanor completely gone. "Listen, we didn't mean," he started, but the man cut him off sharply. "What you meant doesn't matter. What you did is what counts." His words carried a weight that silenced the entire crowd. The suspense was unbearable as everyone waited for what he would say or do next. The tension hung thick in the air, the officers visibly shrinking under his piercing gaze. The man seemed ready to deliver a verdict that would change everything. The moment felt like a ticking bomb, with the entire crowd holding its breath, waiting for the explosion. The silence was deafening, the crowd frozen in anticipation of the man's next words. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, the blare of approaching sirens shattered the stillness. A black SUV pulled up, its tinted windows gleaming under the streetlights. Two sharply dressed men stepped out, their demeanor exuding authority. Without a word, they made their way to the man at the center of the scene, positioning themselves protectively beside him. The lead officer's face turned ashen. This was no ordinary confrontation anymore. It was clear these newcomers weren't just bystanders. The taller of the two leaned in and whispered something to the man. His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of calculation crossing his face. The crowd began murmuring again, the tension climbing as speculation spread. The lead officer, visibly rattled, took a shaky step forward. "Look, this has gone too far. Let's all just calm down," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. The man finally broke his silence. "Calm down," he repeated, his voice laced with quiet intensity. "You lit a cigarette and put it out on my arm, in front of witnesses and cameras. And now you want calm." His words echoed, each syllable a reminder of the severity of the situation. The officer fumbled for a response, but before he could speak, one of the sharply dressed men stepped forward. "Sir, you might want to think carefully about your next move," he said coolly, his gaze piercing. Then came the twist no one expected. The man glanced at the detective, then the crowd, before addressing the officers directly. "This wasn't a random act of disrespect," he said, his tone now sharper. "It was deliberate, and I know why." The crowd gasped, the officers' faces draining of color. "You weren't targeting me by chance," he continued. "You've been working with someone who wanted me out of the way before I could take my position at this precinct." The words hit like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted into shocked murmurs, and the officers froze, caught between denial and panic. The man's gaze bore into them as he added, "And I have proof." The stakes had just skyrocketed, and the question hanging in the air now was, who was behind this, and how far did their influence go? The tension was suffocating, the conflict spiraling into a storm that no one could have foreseen. The air felt heavy as the man stepped forward, his calm demeanor betraying the storm that raged underneath. "You think I don't know who sent you?" he said, his voice low but commanding. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence rapidly crumbling. The crowd leaned in, captivated by the tension. The man pulled out his phone, swiped through it, and held it up for everyone to see. A video played, showing the lead officer in a heated conversation with someone on the other end of the call. "We can't let him take over. He's going to ruin everything," the officer's voice echoed from the phone. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the man continued. "You were taking orders from someone higher up, someone who didn't want me stepping into my new role because I wouldn't turn a blind eye to your corruption." The officers' faces turned pale as they realized the depth of their exposure. The lead officer stammered, "This isn't what it looks like. I was just—" His words faltered as the man cut him off sharply. "Save it. You've already said enough." At that moment, one of the sharply dressed men, now identified as an undercover investigator, pulled out a badge. "We've been watching you for months. You've left a trail of misconduct and bribes that ends here tonight." He turned to the man and added, "Thank you for helping us expose them." The lead officer lunged forward in desperation, but before he could act, he was restrained by his own colleagues, their loyalty shattered by the undeniable proof. Just as it seemed the storm had settled, the man leaned in close to the lead officer and whispered, "The person who ordered this? I've already spoken to them. They'll face justice too." The officer's eyes widened in shock, realizing the betrayal ran deeper than he thought. The man turned to the crowd, his calm confidence restored. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been wronged by people like them," he said, pointing at the now handcuffed officers. The scene ended with the officers being escorted away, their faces a mix of anger and defeat, while the man walked away with his head held high, knowing his fight for justice was only beginning. The crowd erupted in cheers, but the man's parting words lingered. "This isn't over. It's just the start of something bigger."